Hello and welcome to the offices of PMQ. I'm Brian Hernandez, and I am joined in studio today by Steve Green, the publisher of PMQ Pizza Magazine. Hello, Steve.
Thanks, Brian. I'm here right now to introduce Peter Reinhart, a good friend of the pizza industry, a very knowledgeable author. He's a celebrity. He really knows the pizza industry very well, and he's got a new book coming out. And it's not only a book that's for sale right now on Amazon, but it gives us some very inside information on a future wave that's about to occur, is potential for people in the pizza industry. And I wanted to just welcome you to the show, Peter, and thank you for being here. And tell us about what's new for us in the pizza industry.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and it is good to see you again and to be with you again. And thanks for mentioning the book. It's actually not out yet. It'll be out on October 21st. This is what it looks like. It's called Bread Revolution, and it's about some new developments in the world of flour. I'm very excited about what I think is the next wave of flour. So some of the things we're going to refer to today have not been made public yet because the book hasn't come out yet, but there'll be things that are a result of the research that I did in looking into new kinds of flour, some of which I think have some great implications for the pizza world.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, your new book, as you said, which comes out next week, it charts the arrival of what you call a new frontier in flour products, especially the sprouted flour from both wheat and also from other grains. Can you explain what you mean by this new frontier?
Sure. And that really is the key. I mean, what the bread revolution, so to speak, is the original title, my working title for the book was sort of the next frontier. And I think that's what I'm viewing sprouted flour being the main thrust of the next frontier in flour. There are other aspects of flour that are all new and kind of front burner as well. But I think sprouted flour has the potential to be the next big thing in the world of bread, doughs, and flour products in general. And what a sprouted flour is when you take the kernels, the little seeds of wheat, and instead of grinding them immediately into flour, if you germinate the seeds, if you soak them overnight in water and let them start to wake up and grow a tiny little sprout, less than a quarter of an inch long, but just enough to kind of change that wheat from a grain into its process of becoming a grass, which essentially more is in the vegetable category, everything changes about the wheat. The nutritional values improve, the flavor changes dramatically, becomes much sweeter. And the problem has always been that it was assumed that once you did this to the wheat, you wouldn't be able to make bread from it. You couldn't make dough from it. But it turns out that you can. And that's what's been the big discovery. There have been companies that have been making bread from sprouted wheat for a number of years, up to maybe 50, 60 years now. The Ezekiel breads, Alvarado Street breads, those are kind of the two big brands that make bread from sprouted wheat and other grains. But that's different than what I'm talking about, which is sprouted flour. They're both very good. Both of them improve the quality of the wheat by sprouting them. But with the Ezekiel model, you take the wheat and grind it into a pulp after it sprouts. You don't dry it and turn it back into flour. You'll even say right on the packages of those kinds of breads, made without flour, which is technically true. It's made from wheat, but not from flour, because it never goes back into a flour state. The new development is taking those sprouts, putting them in dryers, drying them back down to the hardness of the original wheat, and then milling them into flour and coming up with a totally new product. And this is, while still kind of new and most bakeries and pizzerias are not going to have immediate access to it, is coming on big time. There's a few companies that are selling a lot of this flour now. Their sales are doubling almost every month. And a few of the larger mills, like Bay State Milling on the East Coast, are beginning to get into carrying these sprouted flours because they're all seeing that it makes sense. There's a lot of potential there. And from a competitive edge standpoint, I think it's really important for restaurant operators and pizzeria operators to know about these things because it's always good to be the first one out with them.
Right. Now, after you grind it back down to a flour state, you've dried it out, what kind of changes does that have in the flour? Is it less proof time? I mean, is chemically what happens?
That's a very good point. Yeah. So here's a couple of the benefits of using sprouted flour. Once you figure out how to use the sprouted flour to make a dough, and that one of the things that you have to change is it takes more water. Once it dries, it's actually drier than wheat. So a dough that might have originally taken maybe 65% water to flour to make a nice dough might take 85 to 90% water to make, and it's a whole grain. When you sprout the grains, you're not talking about white flour anymore. You're talking about a whole wheat flour, but the sprouting process changes the flavor of the flour, so it actually tastes more like a blend of about half white flour and half whole wheat flour. It sweetens the flour. It makes it less heavy tasting, and it takes some of the bitterness out of the whole wheat that you normally associate with whole wheat. So it's a radical change in the flavor profile of the wheat itself, and yet you get all of the benefits, in fact, more of the benefits of eating the whole grain. So from a flavor standpoint, sprouting will sweeten the grain. And the reason that it sweetens it is because when you sprout wheat, or any grain for that matter, the natural enzymes that are existing in that grain activate. They kind of come back. They're not really living organisms, but they activate and come to life in the sense that their purpose is to break apart starch and protein molecules into smaller units so that they can be digested by the growing organism or by the organism that's eating it, like us.
Okay.
So what enzymes do is they'll take, for instance, the starch enzymes will go into the starch molecules, break out the natural sugars that create those starches, because let's face it, starch is just complex sugar all woven together into a very tight, almost like a ball of yarn, so complex that you can't taste the sweetness, even though it's made up totally of sugar. What the enzymes do is they release some of those sugars so that we can actually access those flavors. And this is what happens in bread making anyway, and even in regular doughs, the sweetness is being slowly released. So by pre-sprouting the dough, instead of doing all this in the final dough itself, you're already releasing a lot of the natural sweetness. So the first thing you notice about sprouted grain flours is they're much sweeter than the original form. And then because they're sweeter and because the sugars have been released, it's almost like malting, so to speak. The yeast, when it's introduced to the dough, can begin to act on it very quickly and begin to start to ferment it. So a dough that might normally take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours or an overnight fermentation to develop maximum flavor can reach that maximum flavor development in about 3.5 to 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
So that you don't have to actually work as far ahead as you would using some of the artisan techniques that have developed over the last 10 years with pre-ferments and sponges and all the kinds of things that are designed to bring out flavor in the flour. The sprouted flavor can reach its full potential of flavor in a much shorter amount of time. So that's another sort of benefit of being able to work with these, is that you can work in a shorter window. And then, of course, the most important benefit is, the most important benefit from a standpoint of selling is flavor. But the most important benefit for our bodies is that the nutritional value of the sprouted wheat is way better than even whole wheat flour is, because the vitamins and minerals that are in there have been released and made more accessible to our bodies, where they can be broken down and assimilated. So that essentially you've almost doubled the nutritional potential of anything that's made with these sprouted flours. So these are some of the things that are going on. But first and foremost, you'll notice the flavor.
That sounds like a triple win all across the board.
Well, I'll say.
Well,
Yeah.
that's why I think it's the next big thing.
Yeah. Now, what you've talked about sounds very academic, scientific. Has any marketing people gotten a hold of this information and turned it into some easy to understand, easy to digest marketing?
Great question. It's because it's so new. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff on the internet about the health benefits and the flavor benefits of sprouted grains and sprouted seeds and sprouted beans. Sprouting is something that can be done with any kind of seed. So there is stuff out there, but there's a couple of companies that are leading the way in terms of making sprouted flour available for purchasing, whether in wholesale or retail. One of those companies is Lindley Mills out of Graham, North Carolina, a mill that for many years has been responsible for milling the organic flour for King Arthur flour. So anytime you buy like a 5-pound bag or a 2-pound bag of King Arthur organic flour, you're getting flour from Lindley Mills. This is a small mill that's been around for a number of years. But the founder of that mill, Joe Lindley, has gotten very excited about sprouting, and is one of the pioneers in creating this as a market niche. So he's now dedicated a huge part of his mill to totally separate sprouted flour. And that sprouted flour, because of his relationship with King Arthur, can be available or purchased through King Arthur, either in a King Arthur bag or in the Lindley bags, which he calls Super Sprout. So that's one place to go. So if you go to the Lindley Mills website, which is easy to get to, just lindleymills.com, you'll be able to read a lot about it there. The other company that I'm excited about is out of Kilpatrick, Alabama, and it's called To Your Health Sprouted Flour. To Your Health. Again, just go on an internet search to Your Health Sprouted Flour, and it'll lead you to their website. There you will find a lot of recipes, a lot of articles, links to articles that have already been written, and a lot of information from the company itself on the background behind all these sprouted grains and flours. To Your Health produces well over 25 different products, and not just sprouted wheat flour, but also sprouted rye, corn, rice, you name it, they're making it into sprouted flour. Lindley Mills, on the other hand, is focusing on the wheat. And then they also do a gluten-free blend of 5 other grains that don't carry any gluten in them. And we actually use this blend. They just call it their ancient grain blend. And it includes, I think, buckwheat, amaranth, quinoa, millet, and one more, I'll think of it in a second. And they sprout those and grind them into a flour blend that you can then use to make your own gluten-free products from. We actually use that blend in a gluten-free pizza dough at Pure Pizza. We also use some of that blend in our regular sprouted flour with the wheat flour to make 100% sprouted wheat dough with a multigrain aspect by putting a small amount of this multigrain in it. So in other words, there's a lot of play. So they're sprouting 6 different products, wheat and 5 other grains. To Your Health sprouting over 20. I think sometimes they, depending on the time of year, can be doing up to 40 different kinds of sprouted products. And then Bay State Milling just got into the game, and they've recently come out with a sprouted wheat flour. And they're the one company that I think, because of their size, will be able to probably meet the supply needs faster than some of the others. The only difference is that they're not able to source enough organic wheat. Both the other 2 companies use only organically grown wheat. So the Bay State Milling is using commercial grade wheat because it's more plentiful, and they can turn it into sprouted wheat flour very easily. So those are issues that I think are going to work themselves out over the next year as more companies get into the game. Organics is really the best way to go with all of these kinds of products, but the supply isn't there yet. As the demand goes up, more and more farmers will get into growing that way.
Well, you'd mentioned that they're getting into making gluten-free sprouted flours. Where are we at with the gluten-free? I hate to call it a trend, but gluten-free in general. It's not a trend, but is it still growing, or has it plateaued? How should pizza operators?
I think it is a major trend, and it's a trend that hasn't quite plateaued yet. I think that I expect, at least personally from what I've seen, that it will probably hit a plateau fairly soon, mainly because there's a lot of new information coming out almost on a daily basis, sort of discriminating between what's truly gluten sensitive and what is maybe a sensitivity to other things that may be also found in wheat or other products that are affecting people. So not everybody who thinks that they are gluten intolerant are necessarily gluten intolerant. Many are. And there's many people who still don't even know that they have gluten sensitivities. Yeah. So that part of it is still growing the trend. And as better products are coming out made with non-gluten ingredients, we're seeing that category is in the marketplace is huge. It's in the billions of dollars now, whereas 10 years ago, it was just in the few millions of dollars. So that's a huge category. And what's driving it is, number one, the quality and flavor, qualities are getting better, and also the awareness of gluten sensitivity. What's going to sort of level it out, I think, is this new information. For instance, one of the things that is just starting to surface, and it's still so new that we can't really definitively make any claims, but I think it's going to have some impact on gluten sensitivity, is the possibility that it's not the gluten in the wheat that's necessarily causing people to have reactions to wheat. It could be the way the wheat is being handled. There's two categories of this: how the wheat's being handled at the end stage, and I'll get back into that in a second, and also the strains of wheat themselves. Some of these higher protein wheats that are loaded with more gluten may be, in fact, more difficult to digest. There's a lot of theories about that. But the one that's intriguing me right now, because it's so new, I mean, I just read this article 3 weeks ago, and I'm expecting to see more stuff come out on it soon, is that I learned for the first time that at the end of the harvest, most wheat, commercial wheat, not organic wheat, but only commercial wheat, is often sprayed with a spray that contains an ingredient called glyphosate. And glyphosate is a product developed by, I don't know if it's Monsanto or some company, large chemical company like that, that's used in Roundup and other kinds of weed suppressants. But its use on spraying it on the wheat at the end of the harvest is that it causes the seeds of the wheat to release from the pods much easier. In other words, it's easier to shake them out so they get a higher yield on the harvest.
Right.
The downside is once it's sprayed, you can't get it off. It goes into the flour that's made from this wheat, and now for the first time they're beginning to make associations with its effect on our digestive system. And most gluten sensitivities and other kinds of food sensitivities or food allergies really goes back to our gut health. People that have compromised gut health or immune systems tend to be more sensitive to more foods. So the stronger your gut, the less sensitive you are to normal foods. If you start messing with the food by spraying them with things like that, yeah, you're going to run the risk of making people sick. So I'm really hopeful, and I can't make any claims that this is all true. It's only just hypotheses that are coming out in the press, that hopefully that if we can reduce the use of some of these chemicals, then we'll see a decrease in the amount of sensitivity. That doesn't mean that people that have celiac disease aren't legitimately sensitive to gluten.
Right.
Celiac disease is one very specific type that affects about 1.3% of the population. The other 5 to 20% of the people that say they're benefiting from a gluten-free diet, it may be not because of the lack of gluten, but because of other things that are accompanying the gluten that fall into many other food groups that have to do with enzymes. They have to do with the building blocks of proteins and things like that. That eliminating the wheat may be eliminating those things. It's not the gluten per se.
Right.
Still too early, but I think we're going to see a lot more in that. So that's why I think it's an interesting trend to watch. But it's large enough now, and it's not going to go away, that I think anyone in the food business really should pay attention to it and include a gluten-free option on their menus. And many pizzerias are already doing that.
Well, how do you recommend that pizzerias handle that? Do you suggest that they make it in-house in a gluten-free station, or maybe buy some pre-made gluten-free doughs prepackaged?
It's a good question, because there are two choices. For instance, at our pizzeria, we make our own because we came up with our own formula. It's a formula I came up with using the Lindley 5-grain gluten-free blend, and we make it, and it's a fun way to make it, though. It's sort of a two-part process. We make it into a almost like a batter, a pancake batter, and we bake it once, and it comes out sort of soft and floppy, and we can freeze those and keep them for a couple of weeks and build up an inventory of the gluten-free doughs. And when someone orders a gluten-free pizza, we can pull them out and actually then put the toppings on and put it back into the oven, at which time the dough will crisp up. So it's a twice-baked pizza dough. That's one way to go. Then the other way is to buy, there are a number of gluten-free products and pizza doughs already made, pre-baked, ready to be topped, ready to be finished off. Some are maybe even not pre-baked, but just in a form ready to be topped and baked. Both are valid approaches. I think that it's difficult to add another mix into an operation, and frankly, if your bakery is not set up with a totally gluten-free section, and which restaurants really have that? Very few. You can't guarantee to your customer that they're not going to get some cross-contamination. And we can't, even in ours. As pure as the dough itself might be, it's going to be going into an oven that also has wheat products. It's going to be made in mixers that, even though we clean them, have been used for wheat. And there are some people who are legitimately that sensitive to gluten that even if they eat a product that has no gluten in it but was baked in an oven that previously baked something with flour in it, regular flour, they could get sick.
Right.
So we always ask our customers, and I think this is the most important thing, is to make sure that your staff is educated, that they're very sensitive to the levels of gluten intolerance that are out there and take them seriously. So we always ask, when someone asks for a gluten-free dough, are you very sensitive to gluten, or are you doing it as a dietary choice, as a lifestyle choice? And many times they say, no, I'm just trying it out, I'm interested. And so we let them know that that's okay. We never bake any other pizzas in the oven when the gluten-free pizza goes into the oven. But we handle it as much as we can, and we have signs and disclaimers explaining to everybody that there's always the risk of cross-contamination because we're not large enough and don't have the setup for that. So these are the kinds of issues that every restaurant has to have, and I think more and more training is going across the board in the restaurant industry, educating staff, because this is really, for many people, a life or death issue. It's not just a lifestyle choice. Right. So we want to make sure that we take that very seriously. And somebody who has that level of sensitivity, frankly, we can't even, we suggest that they not get a pizza from us because we can't guarantee that they're not going to get some cross-contamination. We do the best we can. But generally, with people that have that level of sensitivity, which is a very small percentage of the celiac community, that they're better off probably making it at home on a certified gluten-free crust in an oven that has been protected from other wheat products. Mm-hmm. It's a big category.
Yeah. And it does, like you said, it takes a lot of consideration and just making sure you keep an eye on all the details, because you can really kind of hurt people. So we got a question.
Yeah. I mean, you broaden your customer base by offering it, but at the same time, you have to know what you're dealing with when you do offer it.
Right. We got a question from the shout box here. Getting back to the new sprouted flours, do you know of any specific pizzeria restaurants that are already making pizzas with them?
Well, I know of one in particular, and that's ours. We kind of started the whole thing. We started it about 2.5 years ago. We're doing two sprouted doughs. One is we call it it's the sprouted whole grain dough. It's a multi-grain dough using 80% wheat, 80 to 90% wheat, sprouted wheat, and about 10 to 20% of the sprouted multi-grain blend. Then we also do the sprouted gluten-free blend. Both of those are totally sprouted flours, no others. There are bakeries that I know of that are using the sprouted wheat either in conjunction with regular wheat or in total. For instance, Whole Foods Markets has their own bake shops, and some of the Whole Foods bake shops, or bake houses they call them, are making sprouted wheat breads, and they've been doing them for about 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer. And in some of the breads, they use a blend of some sprouted wheat or sprouted grain along with regular flour, and in some breads they do 100%. The cost consideration is probably the constraining factor because right now, because of the supply being so low, sprouted flour is more expensive, almost twice as expensive as regular flour. I believe those costs are going to come down as the supply goes up, and you can make back some of those costs in two ways. One is because it absorbs more water, you can add more water, which helps to bring the unit cost down a little bit. And two, if you can factor it into a time-saving manner, meaning that you don't have to tie up as much space or use long processes that entail labor, right. You can save a little bit of the cost that way. But frankly, it's going to be more expensive now. It's the beginning of a new wave. I think that if we revisit this 5 years from now, we're going to see that a lot of the costs will probably, if not come down to the same price as regular wheat, at least come a lot closer.
If you're putting more water in the dough, does that mean that the volume calories per volume is less?
Well, perhaps, except that by the time you bake the dough, of course, you're going to bake out a lot of the water, the moisture. The reason you need that much moisture is because the flour is drier than actually regular ground wheat flour. Wheat flour is generally dried to about 12 to 14% moisture content. And so it always has a little moisture in it, even though it feels dry. Mm-hmm. Sprouted flour is dried, I'm not sure of the exact amount, but I would say it performs at about 7 to 8% moisture content. So it sucks up a whole lot more water. But of course, most of that water gets baked off later at the end. But by adding that water in, you can start with like an 8-ounce dough ball, and it has less flour in it than an 8-ounce dough ball made with, say, white flour or regular whole wheat flour.
Yeah.
So, but in the end, I think that nutritionally, I don't think it's so much a calorie issue. It's probably going to be the same as a whole grain dough. It's more about the flavor issue at that point.
So with the pure at the Pure Pizzeria in Charlotte, is it important that all the flours there are sprouted flours, or do you have a combination of different flours?
We also serve our still most popular pizza is made on a classic white dough using an unbleached white bread flour that is also an organic flour. We get that also from Lindley Mills, since it's he's got an organic mill. He specializes in organically grown flours. Our pizzeria is really focused on the whole idea of local, farm-to-table, organic, sustainable agriculture, all of the green values that are, again, becoming more and more a part of the marketing plan for restaurants and pizza operators as the public is becoming more interested in and supportive of those things.
Okay.
So we just jumped, in front of all of that and decided to dedicate the whole operation to those values. So our toppings are all locally sourced. Anything that we can't get locally, for instance, the tomatoes are organically grown tomatoes. We get the Bianco di Napoli tomatoes out of California that that have become, there's a limited amount of those, but they're quite good. The cheeses, we get some that are locally made cheeses in North Carolina. Some are Wisconsin or even imported cheeses. So we can't make everything local, but the toppings, the greens, even the meats are made by local butchers, the local pepperonis and things like that. Everything that we can get local, we do, and everything that we can get organic, we do. But we don't guarantee that we can do everything organic because the supply is not there. Frankly, the term organic has less cachet right now to the public than local. I think local is a much bigger marketing concept currently. Local, fresh, from the garden to the table, all of those things, people value that right now. Eventually, all of these things become cliches when they get overused, and you start to see them being used by everybody. And even the term artisan, where we used to say artisan bread meant something.
Right.
Now, mass-produced breads are still called artisan breads because it sells bread. So for right now, I think the local, who knows what the next thing will be as far as, as a marketing term. But for a while, since we're at the front end of the wave on not just sprouted flours, but I want to talk a little bit about some other issues in the world of wheat that are not sprouted, things that have to do with heirloom flours or locally milled flours. You can see that there are other factors, wheat that's grown within 100-mile or 200-mile radius of your operation. All of these things also add marketing cachet as well as possibly some, flavor or functionality enhancements as well.
Right. I have another question here from the think tank. Which method do you recommend or prefer as far as when you're creating your dough, like a starter or a biga, or just a traditional of overnight proofing, 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours?
Well, with the sprouted flours, there's no need for a pre-ferment at all because the flour is so close. Once it's hydrated and inoculated with the yeast, it starts to come to life, and the flavor comes out within a few hours. We use a long, slow fermentation for our classic doughs. We're using our white dough. We don't use a pre-ferment or sponge anymore because we age them overnight. We let the dough itself develop over a 24 to 48 hour window, and it will develop without a pre-ferment when it's held that long. I think for pizzerias that are trying to work with the dough on the same day, you can get a pretty darn good dough in the same day by working with a sponge, either a poulish or a biga or any kind of sponge that starts the flavor development and the enzyme activity and the acidity development ahead of time, and then you can start early in the morning and have a dough by the afternoon that has full flavor. And there are operations that work that way as well. And I know of a few very good pizzerias that use a combination. They still use a sponge, they use the overnight method, and they hold it for 36 hours to 40 hours before they actually use it. They use all of it. They pull out all the stops because they believe in it. Would the dough be as good without the sponge? You could argue it either way. I think probably you can make a case that it would be, but when you have a formula that works, you don't want to mess with it.
Right.
And even if it could work a different way, why bother when you've got something that people love? And so I try not to tell people to change their recipes if their clientele loves them. But if they're getting feedback that indicates that there's room for improvement, then that's when we start looking at some of these techniques.
Now, personally, do you feel one way or another yields more flavor? I mean, they could probably, if left to equally rise as long, a few extra days for the traditional method, it could probably meet the flavor. But I mean, flavor-wise, is there one that you think yields more flavor?
Or in terms of a formula or a recipe,
or just like using a poolish versus doing it overnight, or is it just a matter of timing, really?
It's a tough question to answer because flavor is such a personal thing.
Right.
I think that when we discovered the principle of pre-ferments about 20 years ago in the bread movement, I mean, people have been using old dough or sponges for a long time before that, but we started to get into the science of it as we learned from French and German bakers, the art of baking. We found that working with pre-ferments generally improved the bread.
Okay.
But that's because most bakeries also are trying to make that bread on the same day that they mix it.
Right.
It's very difficult for a bakery to hold doughs overnight because if they're working in thousands of loaves, there's just no room to hold them and to chill them down. So it makes sense to do them all in one continuous activity. A sponge or a pre-ferment you can hold overnight and then add it to your final dough. With pizzerias, most pizzerias tend to make their doughs a day ahead anyway. So they're already getting, I would say most pizza dough, if turned into a loaf of bread, would probably make a better bread than most of the breads that are being sold on the shelves, just simply because they're made the day ahead and they benefit from that long fermentation, whether you have a pre-ferment or not.
Right.
So I think that there's sort of a diminishing return of doing too many things to the dough. If you're using some natural leaven, a sourdough starter, or a piece of wild yeast starter in there as a pre-ferment, it's going to need a certain amount of time to develop that flavor. And then, of course, you've got to watch that. It's the art of baking is really a balancing act of time, temperature, and ingredients. They kind of form a triangle. I call it the baking triangle: time, temperature, and ingredients. And if you do something to one point of that triangle, it affects the other 2 points. So, for instance, if you're going to hold the dough for 48 hours, but you've got a piece of sourdough starter in there, that could make the dough too acidic and too sour. And so you have to affect and balance the time. You may have to either reduce the amount of starter or lower the amount of time that you hold that in the refrigerated environment, or you may make it on the same day. In other words, you have to play with it. So there's no one rule. I think that though, if you feel that your dough has room for improvement and you're not already using a pre-ferment, that might be the best place to start. Is perhaps use about 35% of the total flour weight that goes in on the final mix. Figure out what 35 to 40% of that is, and make a sponge that weighs that amount. If you're using 50 pounds of flour, then you might use 17 pounds of sponge, whether it's a poolish or a piece of old dough or a biga. There's different kinds of pre-ferments. Put that in there, and then treat your dough the way you would normally treat it, and see if you notice a difference. Sometimes it will make a difference, and it could be the difference that can elevate your dough to the next level. But I find that most pizza operators are already doing pretty good doughs. They're just looking maybe for that final little tweak if they feel that it can be better, if you've had a dough somewhere else. And sometimes it may not be the dough that's the issue. It might be the baking temperature, or the way the heat's being applied, or it could be the fermentation temperatures. There's all sorts of other factors, and it could be the flour itself. There could be another flour that might give you more flavor. I always tell my students, because I teach this bread course here, that the mission of the baker is to evoke the full potential of flavor that's trapped in the flour, in the grain. And they do that by using the craft of the baker. Whether it's fermentation, the application of time, of temperature, the proper manipulation of ingredients. These are all the tricks. But in the end, the goal is the same. It's the same for a bread maker or a pizza maker, is to evoke the full potential of flavor in those ingredients. And sometimes the difference between a good bread and a great bread is just simply time, or the way it was handled, or perhaps the final handling of the dough before it went into the oven. It could be as simple as that. And that comes from practice, and it comes from understanding how these different factors affect the final product. It's all practice in the end.
Right. You got something for him, Steve?
Yeah,
I don't know if that. I hope that answers the question. It's sort of a roundabout way, but
Yeah.
there is no one answer. That's the problem.
Right.
Now in bread
Yeah.
competitions, there are some formulas that are made with a poolish, some that are made with what's called a pâte fermentée, which is just a piece of old dough from yesterday's dough going into today's dough. There's some that are made with a biga, which is a piece of old dough without salt. They're all valid approaches, and they all can work. Because they all do the same thing. They age the dough and bring in developed flavors, but they each work in a different way. And so once you become comfortable with one of those methods, there's no reason to try to use every one of those methods. They all will get you there.
Yeah, I knew it was kind of a loaded question when I read it out to you. So,
Peter, I got a question
I just learned something new too in the latest issue of PMQ, where Tom Lehman talks about using malted versus unmalted flours. Because most flour that we buy already includes some malted barley flour, which helps with browning.
Right.
But he mentions that there's a lot of flours that are used in the high temperature ovens, like the Naples style pizzas where you're baking at 800 degrees, where having malt in the dough might not be an advantage because it might brown the crust too quickly.
Right.
You see, and this is just something that we don't generally think about when we get settled into a formula, but that there's little things like that. The flour that's coming in might be where the change needs to happen.
Yeah. Have you ever figured out how many variables there are in this equation of perfect bread? Yeah. I guess it. No.
I know that's a good mathematics.
Yeah.
That's a question for these guys who are really good at hitting logarithms or whatever.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: for those of our viewers like myself that aren't that familiar with heirloom flour, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a whole other area of interest. And I'm bringing all these things up now, not that necessarily all or any of these things are germane to each individual's operation, but it's always good to kind of know what's coming next, to see, to spot a trend before it actually tips over and becomes a fad. You want to be kind of in the front of the wave if you can, and especially if some of these things can affect your products. So in addition to sprouted flour, which I think is just getting some traction now, and probably, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg on that. Another area where we're seeing the tip of the iceberg is that, number one, there's a lot of interest in this term ancient grain. And ancient grain can mean a lot of things. It can be a grain that's not even wheat. It can be quinoa, or a grain that's been around forever. All grains, right, when you think about it, are ancient grains. Wheat is an ancient grain. And the only difference between ancient grain wheat and non-ancient grain wheat is if it's from a hybrid, a modern hybrid, like the small dwarf wheats that were developed 60 years ago that revolutionized the agricultural business, then that wouldn't be considered an ancient wheat. But some of the ancient wheats that fall in this larger category of ancient grain would include things like spelt, emmer. Emmer is an ancient strain of wheat. It's similar to spelt. Einkorn is one of the oldest strains. And there's interest in these older strains because some of the books that are attacking wheat, like Wheat Belly, and kind of get off of wheat, they'll say, well, maybe if you are not going to get off it completely, go back to eating some of these ancient strains before the genetic makeup of the wheat changed, when they were simpler, easier to break down. And you know what? Some people are having good results with that. There's another one called Corazon, which is sold commercially as Kamut, K-A-M-U-T, which is a trademark name. So Kamut has now given way to its other name, and it was called. And Khorasan is the region in the Mesopotamian area, which is where this wheat gets the original areas where wheat came from. Of course, lately that word's been used in some negative ways.
Yeah, it has.
So it's kind of ironic that just when the idea of Khorasan flour, caught on, that this group came out and started doing bad things under that name.
Yeah.
I think the Khorasan flour will outlast the bad guys, but those are kind of examples of these. They're not new. They're old strains of wheat that are getting new life. Mm-hmm. And from a marketing standpoint, because there is interest and people are reading these books and have concerns about their wheat, it's something to play with. If you have access to these, and one of the best ways to get access to these strains is to also connect with mills that are in your region, because that's the other big thing that's happening. And you're going to see this thing explode over the next couple of years. A few years ago, there were only a few small mills these new mills that were working with local farmers to try to grow wheat in your region, mill it in your region, and sell it in your region as sort of like the artisan bread version of milling. And we're seeing now, it was very small a few years ago, all of a sudden it's starting to like pop like popcorn. Where there might have been 5 or 6 of these mills, now we're seeing 20, 30, every region, every state, almost every county is starting to get small mills. It's becoming another option for people who want to get into the art and craft of food products, is to mill locally. And farmers are now growing strains of wheat that might be indigenous to their region. We're seeing a lot of work being done in Western Washington State at Washington State University. They've got a whole project in which they're planting very regionally specific wheats. So that's something I talk about a little bit in the book, is this notion of regional specificity or regionally specific wheat. Wheat that's designed to grow better in your region than it might in Kansas or in the Dakotas, where most of the wheat's coming from. It grows really well in the wetlands as opposed to the drylands. Things like that. In North Carolina, wheats are being grown that work really well locally, and some of them work well for bread, some work well for pastries, some work well for pizzas. And so we're seeing more interest in that. It's still, the supply is small, but the cool thing is if you can develop a relationship with one of your local mills, you can then you can leverage that relationship in your marketing, and you can put that on your menu. You can make it part of your what differentiates you from the competition, and you can have something that maybe nobody else has. And at the same time, it's fun to be educated into these wheats. And a lot of these mills will send you samples. They'll do tastings for you. You have a chance to really kind of develop a palate for the subtle flavor differences between different kinds of wheat. Not just the flavor differences, but the performance differences. Yeah. Some are very extensible. Some are very elastic. Some don't handle acidity very well. They're all different. But the key is, I think, to, again, grab onto this notion of the regional and local passion that's developing now, not just among the culinary world, but among your customer base.
That's an area where an independent could go and a chain wouldn't be able to follow them in that direction.
I think so. It makes it's a lot easier to do it on a single location or a small, a couple of locations than when you have a battleship of an operation where you can't really, the supply's not there, first of all, and it's hard to turn that ship around. But you can be sure of one thing. If it works well for the small independent operators, the large companies are going to be making note of it, and sooner or later they're going to, perhaps want to get their foot in that game as well. It's better to be in front of them than to be playing catch up.
Mm-hmm. So is it synonymous, heirloom, with the ancient grains? Is that, you had answered? I asked you about heirloom, and then the answer was ancient grains.
That's a good question, because there's a lot of terminology now, confusion as well. For instance, an ancient grain doesn't necessarily mean an heirloom strain. And heirloom strains usually come from companies like Anson Mills, which is a wonderful company in South Carolina that revitalizes and brings back into the earth. Basically, it gets replanted seeds that have been saved, that have gone out of popularity because they were eclipsed by maybe something that grew easier or could grow in large commodity fields. But what they search for are grains that have better flavor. So they're bringing back strains of corn, for instance, that have way more flavor than the commodity corns that we're used to, today, that we generally get, but that they're hard to find. They're finding farmers who will commit to growing it, and then Anson Mills and companies like Anson Mills will then buy that grain and sell it to, mostly they'll start with chefs. The chef community is always in front of the public on these kinds of things. So if you want to look for where trends begin, to see what are some you can grab, look at some of the white tablecloth restaurants that are part of the farm to table movement, and see what they're championing. A couple of years ago, when these heirloom corn grits became available, all of a sudden you started seeing grits on all of these menus, and now grits have become a national food, whereas before it used to be kind of a southern regional thing. Now they're exploding everywhere because suddenly people realize how good grits could be. But there are grits and there are grits. Regular grits made from the standard corn are just going to be so-so. Grits made from some of these newly planted strains, but of these heirloom varieties, are on a whole other level. It's kind of like people will taste grits made with this, and they'll go, I never had grits before, even though they've been eating it all their life. They'll say, I never knew corn could taste this good. So we're seeing this happen with other grains as well. Whereas quinoa and some of these other grains that are technically ancient, they're not, quote, heirloom strains, although they could be if farmers find a particular rare strain of them and have saved the seeds and planted them. So the term ancient grain and heirloom are slightly different. Heirloom really indicates some special seed saving and commitment from certain farmers to plant them and to grow them in ideal circumstances in the right regions. And it's a whole other level of farming and of marketing.
So,
But we're seeing more of it, and it's growing. And 20, 30 years ago, these things were happening. 40 years ago, when I had my first restaurant, it was a little organic restaurant in Boston in 1971. We knew about all those things then, and we thought it would just be a matter of 4 or 5 years before everybody caught on. Well, 40 years later, 45 years later, the rest of the world is catching on. And this time, I don't think it's going to stop. It's growing, and pretty exponentially now. And just like gluten-free tipped over about 4 or 5 years ago, I think we're going to be seeing some of these other ideas because they make sense. They're intuitively right and correct. They're going to tip over as well once more and more farmers can find a way to make a living growing these kinds of grains for us.
Hey, a question from the shout box here. Gluten, how does it exist naturally in flour? Or does it?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up. Can you say that again?
Gluten, how does it exist naturally in flour? Because I know a lot of people are nervous about just being in the room with flour because of the gluten, but...
Yes. Well, gluten itself is a protein that is primarily made up of two smaller proteins. One is called gliadin, and the other is called glutenin. And they exist in most abundance in wheat. They exist in lesser amounts in rye, and to a smaller amount in barley. Those are the three main grains that have the potential to make gluten. But even in wheat flour, there's no actual gluten until you add water. Because until you add the water to the dough and make a dough, the gliadin and the glutenin exist independently of each other. But when they're hydrated and they begin to absorb water, they expand and they eventually link up. They find each other and they bond. And they create from two partial proteins or small proteins, they create a larger protein, a larger, longer, stronger molecule. And that's what allows wheat flour to stretch so well. It traps the carbon dioxide. It gives the dough a chance to grow and get these beautiful air pockets and a large crumb and a webbing and all the things that we associate with bread. That's why wheat is the king of all flour for breads as we know it. Rye is second because it has about half the amount of gluten-forming proteins. Barley barely enough to do anything, but enough to make someone sick if they have celiac disease. And then we see a little bit of cross-contamination in oats. Not because oats naturally have it as part of their DNA, but because in the fields, oats are often grown close enough to wheat to where there's some blowover, and somehow there's some there can be some contamination. Maybe if not in the oats themselves, but in the milling of the oats or the rolling of the oats, where it'll pick up some molecules from flour dust, from wheat flour dust, and it will get in with the oats. So people with high degrees of sensitivity are even wary of oats unless they come from a certified organic, proven gluten-free facility. Most other grains, the quinoas and teff, which is another hot grain right now, Ethiopian grain in the millet family, tiny little seed type grain that has no gluten. We see those in Ethiopian breads like injera. But now chefs are getting, they're jumping on the teff bandwagon this year. What are some others? Amaranth, again, it's an ancient grain. It goes way back. Very small seed, high in protein. All of these things, and they have protein, but not gluten proteins. And so it's a good protein, something you can cook with, or you can add to a bread to give it some protein boost and a little bit of a little bit of a grassy flavor. Chia seeds. Chia seeds are big right now. They're having, I think every 10 years or so there's a chia rebirth. It usually starts with those commercials with the chia pets, and then all of a sudden everybody goes, wait a minute, they're good for you too. And they give you, bursts of vitality, and they're great for long distance runners and all those things. Chia seeds are hot right now. They're probably this year's flax. If flax was big a couple years ago, chia is the flax of today. I'm not sure what the next one will be after chia seeds, but you can be sure there will be something else coming down the pike that are all in the seed family. They could be from grass seeds, or they could be pseudo grains that are not necessarily a true grain, but are similar to grain. I think that quinoa might be an example of a product that's not technically a grain in the way that wheat is, but we call it a pseudo grain because it grows in a similar fashion. Buckwheat is not in the wheat family. I don't know why it's called buckwheat, but it got that name maybe because it was used in breads originally like wheat, but it has no gluten at all, and it's a very nutritious grain. So we see a lot of that. So these things are always available, and they're great to use to supplement other products, but no gluten, which is, if you're trying to stay gluten free, that's a good thing to know.
So a high percentage of these ancient grains are in fact gluten free.
That's right. Other than wheat, barley, and rye, unless the grains have been cross-contaminated, then chances are they're going to be gluten-free. And their companies like Bob's Red Mill that sell them at supermarkets, and I know, having been to Bob's Red Mill's facility, they have a dedicated gluten-free facility for those, so that there's no cross-contamination. At To Your Health, where they do the sprouted grains, they have a whole section of sprouted gluten-free breads, and they also have a separate facility, separate from where they do the wheat, so that there's no cross-contamination. So the companies that are serious about that, Whole Foods Bakehouses have dedicated bakehouses. The gluten-free breads baked by the Whole Foods Bakehouses are baked in dedicated gluten-free facilities where there's no cross-contamination. And it's important. The larger your operation, the more you want to be able to guarantee that.
Right.
And it's hard to guarantee it in a small operation, obviously.
Peter, we're almost at the end of our time. Do you have any other questions there? I've got one that I.
Why don't you take it away, Steve? Make it a good one.
Well, we're closing we're closing out now, but I had a question because you kind of brought it up and it made me think. I agree with you that pizzerias can make a better bread than a lot of bakers. Certainly, what you can buy at Kroger's or A&P. Right. Do you know of anybody in the pizza business that moonlights as far as making bread?
Well, I mean, the classic version of that is Pizzeria Bianco in Phoenix, which sort of is very often held up as the poster child for this artisan pizza movement. And the first thing you notice when you eat there is that in addition to great pizza, is they put this great bread on your table made from the pizza dough, and they basically look like ciabatta breads or a rustic loaf with a really nice hard golden crusty crust. And for many years in Phoenix now has some good bakeries, but for many years when people said, where can I get good bread in Phoenix, they would say, go to Pizzeria Bianco because his bread is better than every bakery's as well. And I think that more and more, obviously pizzerias are now making garlic knots and other bread products from their pizza dough. But the opportunity to make some classic sort of crusty breads, European style hearth bread, so to speak, from pizza dough is there for a lot of people. I know there are a few other pizzerias that are making breads, but I can't think of the names right now. I haven't been keeping a list of those, but I hear about them. I get emails from them saying, hey, we've started doing bread from our pizza dough, and people seem to like it. And I think if you've got time in the schedule and you've got dough, now you're not going to make great bread from your leftover. At the end of the day, if you've got doughs that have been sitting out and you go, well, I might as well bake them up into bread and sell them, they could be over fermented, and you don't want to make bad bread from over fermented or overproof dough. Most of these places are setting aside a certain amount of their pizza dough and treating them as bread doughs and giving them the proper treatment that a good bread dough would have, the right fermentation time. And then they're baking them separate from the pizzas and just putting them aside and trying to bake them before they open the doors, perhaps, or having them out there and slicing them, putting them on the table. I think I recently had a bread in a pizzeria in Madison, Wisconsin, that is making their own bread as well, doing that exact thing. So it's within the realm of possibility to be the best bread baker in your town, as well as being the best pizza place.
Well, what I was envisioning is it seems like whenever you're in Paris between 4 and 6 o'clock, you see these people walking around with baguettes. And I was thinking in my town, if I had a pizzeria, it would be great to see people walking around with baguettes with your store name on it. Between 4 and 6 o'clock, they go home and then they order a pizza.
I love it. I love it. And, it's just there's not much difference. The art and craft are so similar that it wouldn't take much for now. If somebody is interested in getting into really putting out high quality artisan bread, I highly suggest joining the Bread Bakers Guild of America. It's a great organization. There's so much knowledge and wisdom available. Essentially, for a very low membership fee, it's like, I don't know, $70 a year or something to join. You have access to about 20 years now of collected wisdom, and we have trainings and workshops around the country that people can come to very quickly come up to speed. So that's one way to get the knowledge. Since we're running out of time, final plug for this. This will be out on October 21st. I think you can pre-order it now.
Can you back it up a little bit?
It won't be available to the 21st. It's called Bread Revolution.
You're too close.
We talk a lot about these grains.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. That's it.
There we go.
Bread Revolution. We got 3.
Anyway,
Okay.
Bread Revolution will be out October 21st. A lot of these things that we talked about will be covered there as well.
Okay.
And of course, in addition to the ongoing, wonderful information on PMQ, on my website, pizzaquest.com, we continue also to put out new things as we hear about them. And we recently interviewed Liz Barrett, whose wonderful new pizza book is out. So we're in the same thing of trying to share that knowledge. The great thing about, I think, people in the bread and pizza world is their generosity in sharing knowledge. It's not like everybody's sitting on their secrets. Everybody's willing to share because there's room for everybody. Because it's hard we all know how hard it is to do it well. Mm-hmm. So we want to encourage the whole category to do it well, and it benefits everyone.
Peter, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's been great to be with you, and
very
I
good.
look forward to another opportunity to get together.
We appreciate
Very
your
good.
time. We're about to wrap it up here. If you have any other questions for Peter, as he said, visit pizzaquest.com. I'm sure there's an easy way to get in touch with him there about any kind of flour or milling questions you might have. We will also post this up in our pmq.com/webinar page, where you can view it later at your own pace. So if you have any other questions, be sure to reach out to Peter. And for all of us here at PMQ, we'd like to thank you for joining us for one of our live chats, and stay tuned because we will be having more and very soon.
Very good.